There is another point of view, that what he interprets as the results of paleo-contact is in actual fact the legacy of a previous global civilization. Now let's see what does not fit into the cultic historical myth. This here is a page of the magazine Technika Молодежи, number 5 for 1969. At the top of the page is a photograph taken by the American Lunar Orbiter 2 station from an altitude of 50 kilometers. In the picture, objects are casting shadows. In nature, objects with a height-to-diameter ratio greater than 5 are extremely rare. Here there are many of them. They are all concentrated in one place. Some kind of natural anomaly? But then why is the plan for the location of these spires here mirrored in relation to the plan for the placement of the pyramids in Giza? Are the pyramids in Giza also natural anomalies, or were they once imprinted? Our civilization did not build anything on the moon. The authenticity of this image, not NASA, not anyone has denied. It is on the internet. It can be found if you search for Lunar Orbiter 2. Medieval map. It depicts Antarctica without an ice shell. Antarctica was discovered in 1820-21 by a Russian Antarctic expedition led by Bellinghausen and Lazarev. A map from the Middle Ages. Moreover, it is not the only one. Further, if you remember the school course in geography, then with latitude in general, everything is more or less simple. The height of the sun above the horizon allows you to recalculate this matter in the coordinate of the north or south latitude. And how about longitude? And with longitude there are difficulties. The planet rotates, and in general it turns out that if you want to determine the longitude of an area, you must know where the prime meridian is, and you must have some device that stores the time of the prime meridian there where you are. And accordingly, if on the prime meridian sunrise is at a certain time, for you sunrise is at a different time, then you can recalculate taking into account the daily cycle, where you are, on which meridian. These ancient maps have been drawn with such an accuracy that mathematics, cartography and chronometry in our civilization has only allowed since somewhere around the 18th century of our era. Before the 18th century of our era, this accuracy was in principle impossible, because there were no chronometers. As noted in the book about Captain Vrungel, it is very inconvenient to sail with weight clocks, whose weights swing in a storm, and the accuracy, of course, leaves much to be desired. The first chronometers were made in England around the time of the expedition of Cook, and they provided the accuracy needed to produce such maps. This here photograph was taken somewhere in the vicinity of Mount Ararat. The website where it was published reports that during the excavations, fossilized structures of the ship's wooden hull and anchor stones were found. Here is a photo of one of the anchor stones. In ancient times, heavy stones were used as anchors. A hole in the stone for the anchor rope to pass through. And the petrified wooden hull structures are composed of trees that do not have tree rings. If you believe the Bible, then in antediluvian times, on the whole earth, there was an even climate, and there were no reasons for the appearance of annual rings. Further, the question is about the size of the ark. If you look at the Bible, the dimensions of the ark are given there. And it turns out to be comparable in size to a nuclear-powered icebreaker of the Arctica class. It's about 150 meters long, about 30 meters wide, and a rather tall hull. The largest wooden ships built by our civilization look like this. This is the 130-cannon, 3-deck battleship 12 Apostles, a fragment of the map from the painting by Ayvazovsky. Its dimensions. The length is slightly less than 70 meters, that is, half the size of the ark. The width, about 18 meters, also about half the size of the ark, and the hull is also lower than the hull of the ark. That is, when a man of the era of wooden shipbuilding read the Bible and saw the dimensions of the ark, saw the ships of our civilization, he had reason to be surprised. Egypt, watercolor, 1839. The Sphinx is covered with sand almost up to its ears. In the memory of our civilization, most of the time it looked approximately like this. It's located in one of the driest places on the planet. When the sand was cleared from the base, it turned out that the base of the Sphinx had been damaged by water erosion. What is the difference between water and wind erosion? The wind blows along the surface, drives sand, and sand, with all sorts of dust microparticles, knocks out particles from stones. It takes quite a long time, but there remain horizontal traces of destruction, as the wind blows which carries the sand. But water flows from top to bottom. Therefore, water erosion leaves traces more or less vertical or close to vertical. The base of the Sphinx is damaged by water erosion. In order for this damage to occur, it is required that the Sphinx be watered for centuries, if not millennia. But in order for the Sphinx to be watered by showers, it's required that it be in a tropical zone where there are showers. In addition, the obelisks of Egypt were used at one time as sundials. That is, the scales on which they cast shadows have been preserved. And it turns out that the scales are uneven. Morning, noon, and sunset hours have different durations if correlated with our modern clocks. Does anyone need a watch for whichever purpose, in which the morning hours are of one duration, the midday hours of a different duration, and the pre-sunset hours again of a different duration? But if Egypt is displaced 15 degrees south, then it finds itself in a zone watered by tropical showers, and the scales of the sundials again become even. In Egypt, many researchers note the degradation of building technologies, because everything is assembled from large stone blocks, and above this masonry of blocks rises a masonry of small, poorly processed stones, which does not in any way lead to the thought that it was done by the same highly professional builders. Plus, traces of some structural elements remained in the granite, which are now lost, but the accuracy of the surface treatment of which raises doubts that it was done by hand, to say nothing of the question of why it was done. Bosnia. Here there are also pyramids. The pyramids are assembled from concrete blocks. The roads near the pyramid are also made of concrete blocks. The pyramids are covered with a layer of soil about a meter thick, sometimes more. For the formation of a layer of soil of this thickness in the conditions of the Mediterranean, according to soil scientists, from 10 to 15,000 years are required. According to the official version of history, in those days there was no one to build these pyramids. The already mentioned Erich von Daniken wrote the book The Stone Age Was Different. Among other things that he says there, he insists that the sanctuaries of the Stone Age in Europe are not randomly located. Here a tribe is living, something came to their mind, we want a sanctuary. They found the nearest hill, stuck a few stones there, and started making sacrifices. This was not the case. It turns out that all the sanctuaries of the Stone Age, at least the most significant, are located on rays that converge in the Delphi region, where, in ancient times, the Delphic oracle was located. That is, the entire complex of sanctuaries of the Stone Age. This is a project of pan-European scale, which does not correspond to the historical myth that there were ancient tribes who lived with their interests within the horizon. And again, it turns out that many stone tools were not found where the stone was taken for their production. That is, the logistics also carried a trans-European character in some cases. In general, the only version that explains what happened is that somewhere around 13,000 years ago, a global geophysical catastrophe took place. As a result of this catastrophe, the lithosphere turned relative to the core, or the position of the planet relative to the plane of the ecliptic changed. Antarctica left the mild subtropical climate to where it is. Egypt went north. On the territory of modern Yakutia, there were deposits of freshly frozen mammoths and everything else, since the catastrophe was of a fleeting character and the dead animals did not have time to decompose. This is the only version that explains all these anomalies that don't fit into the historical myth. But besides the global catastrophe, to all appearances there were local catastrophes. Therefore there was a worldwide flood, but there were also local catastrophes, which were accompanied by floods and everything else. And some historians are trying to replace these local catastrophes to close the question of a global catastrophe and what was before it on the planet. If we turn to history in its entirety, this is a collection of biographies of all the people who ever lived. But in this form, history is not available to any of us. Therefore, the question is in which case the selection of facts from history is scientifically consistent, and in which case the selection of facts from the same history is not scientifically consistent. In addition to this, questions arise about the identification of falsification in the historical past. Since Herzen was right when, in the preface to one of his books, he wrote, "We are not allowed to know history yet. The Russian government, as a reverse providence, improves not the future for the better, but the past." This has been the case throughout history. This finds expression in the aphorisms that history is written by the victors, but this applies not only to the victors, the warriors of the state with each other, because why Carthage was bad, we know, not from the point of view of those who lived in Carthage, but from the point of view of the victorious Rome, in which the words, "Carthage must be destroyed," were heard for a long time. But this also applies to internal history, because if Emperor Paul was killed, then this had to be hidden and explained by the fact that Paul was bad. The same applies to evaluations of the death of Peter III, because in order for Catherine to reign in peace, she had to present Peter III as a villain and a madman and show her own virtue. Therefore, the question of how history is falsified is also a very relevant question. From this I began that historical science, in certain ways, studies what is not in the present, but which has left its traces, which we may know, we may not know, and which we somehow interpret. Traces may be left, but unknown. Well, there may also be traces that are here in front of our own eyes, but we don't perceive them as traces. One example of such a question is the question of the cultural layer in many of our cities. Because if you dig in it, you will find the first floors of buildings that are filled up. Historians say this is a cultural layer. Geologists say not a snowball's chance. These are some kind of deposits. Where and how the deposits came from, historians do not know, and geologists do not know either. Historians insist that these are geological deposits, not a cultural layer. Back in Soviet times, there was an anecdote. Here it is on the right. Radio Tbilisi reported that a wire had been found at the excavations, which indicates that the ancient Georgians had a telegraph. In response, the Armenian radio reported that no wire had been found. This indicates that the ancient Armenians already had wireless telegraph. This is to the question of whether the same findings can be interpreted in a mutually exclusive way. In addition to this, there were publications on the theme that archaeologists also joke. And archaeological jokes are expressed in the fact that if the excavations are carried out, not up to the point where the area is completely cleaned up, and there is something left for future archaeologists, then you can throw something to them from the modern. When archaeologists, after a few centuries, poke around there and find a modern clock among the tools of the Stone Age, they will be in a big puzzle. After all, this also takes place, although not massively. Therefore, the question of the reliability of history, this is a question of how a person can enter the memory of the noosphere and read from there reliable information about what actually happened, how and by whom, for what purposes historical documents were falsified. And they were falsified directly. And among other things, there is such a tendency that if people commit some errors and abuses, and report the work done to their higher authorities, then they don't write that here we honestly saw the entire budget, and they either hide their errors and abuses, or present them as indisputable achievements for which they must be praised, patted on the head, bestowed with ranks and awards, and so on and so forth.
Представляют как неоспоримые достижения, за которые их надо похвалить, погладить по головке, одарить чинами и наградами и так далее и тому подобное. То есть ссылки
That is, references to documents do not at all mean that if, having raised a certain set of documents, we will get a reliable idea of what happened. When perestroika began, an anti-Stalin article was published in the Leningrad newspaper Smena, and one of the points on which Stalin was accused was that Stalin reproached historians. Historians do not use the opportunity to interview witnesses of events, but blindly believe the documents of the era, and this is not how it should be done. So, Stalin was reproached for this. It was in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And it was about the events of the Great October Revolution and the Civil War. Then there begins an interesting thing. When the Great Patriotic War ended, a commission was created that was engaged in a simple matter. They interrogated the commanders, sole chiefs of military units, divisions of military units that were deployed in the first half of 1941 in the Western military districts. A survey was carried out on the theme: what orders did you receive, from whom, how were they carried out, to whom did you report? The commission did not complete its work in connection with the murder of Stalin, and its materials were classified. What could the commission have revealed? The commission could have revealed what is written about by Martirosyan. Martirosyan is a historian who specializes in the history of the Great Patriotic War, and he insists that the catastrophe of the summer of 1941 was conditioned by the fact that the troops were deployed not in accordance with Shaposhnikov's plan, but in accordance with Tukhachevsky's plan. And as a result, what happened happened. Who is responsible for deploying troops? Defense Minister and Chief of the General Staff. The Minister of Defense on the eve of the war is Marshal Timoshenko. The Chief of the General Staff in the pre-war half-year is Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, who is presented to us in the quality of Marshal of Victory, without whom Stalin would not have accomplished anything. And when Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, in one of his speeches or articles, hinted to Zhukov that if Zhukov behaved incorrectly, then the questions of actions of 1941 would be raised, and Zhukov began to behave correctly. Therefore, the question about what our history is, how it's reflected in the documents, and how to extract from these documents what actually happened, this is a separate theme. Now let's have a look. This is one of the last photographs of the Titanic. The Titanic has already embarked on her final voyage. Below is a computer reconstruction of what the bow half of the Titanic looks like at the bottom of the ocean. In the process of sinking, the Titanic broke in half, and its bow and stern ends at the bottom rest in different places. What is the problem? The problem is that 14 years before the real Titanic perished, Morgan Robertson wrote the novel Futility. The novel is on the internet in translation to Russian. This is pretty boring reading, so it's not a fun detective story or anything else, it's pretty boring. But among this tediousness, there is a steamer in which the Titanic is recognized. She was the fastest, the most luxurious, the biggest. She has 4 pipes, 3 propellers. In the maiden voyage, being inhabited by the richest people and the common people, she collided with an iceberg, received injuries incompatible with the ability to sail, and she sank. There weren't enough boats for everyone, and on top of that, the steamer was called the Titan. When the Titanic sank, Robertson was still alive, and somewhere there was a publication on the theme that when he was asked why he had Titan and not Titanic, he replied that he had a vision of a sinking ship. The perspective was from the stern, and the stern in plan is round, semicircular. There is an inscription on it with a name, and he read the name as Titan, since the last 2 letters were out of his field of vision. Well, again the question arises, how could this have happened that 14 years before the described events, the events have already been described? Is this an accident? That is, are there no cause-effect relationships in this? Or is there, after all, some cause that allowed Robertson to write such a novel? And here is another on the same theme. The magazine Arrangement and Repair, number 3463, 3rd to the 9th of September 2001. The same ones are crossed out, the World Trade Center building. Then remember, there was also about the theme that if in Windows you enter the font wingdings, all sorts of symbols, type a certain combination, then we will also get the perished Trade Center building.
Набрать определенную комбинацию, то мы тоже получим здание торгового центра. Вот если исходить из того, что
If we proceed from the fact that history is algorithmic,
алгоритмично, то есть
that is, history is an expression of psychodynamics.
психодинамика
Psychodynamics of society, this is the result of the fact that everyone does what he wants, does not do what he does not want to do, and in the end, it turns out as it turns out.
Ну, а если психодинамика это
Well, if psychodynamics is the totality of the psyches of once living people, currently living people,
информационно-алгоритмическая система,
then the psyche is an informational algorithmic system that determines the character of the interaction of each of us with other people, with the natural environment.
то коллективная психика тоже
Then a collective psyche is also formed. It carries a certain algorithmics of development, and if history expresses this algorithmics of development, then it's clear that Morgan Robertson could well have read down this dynamics, its algorithmics, from the noosphere,
эту динамику,
and described it in the novel.
ее алгоритмику из ноосферы, описать ее в романе, поскольку
Since society did not change, then
то оно построило
it
Титаник
built the Titanic and sank it in the way it was written by Morgan Robertson.
Морганом Робертсоном, но не потому, что он так
But not because he is such an evil villain and dreamer who took up and wrote this,
писал такое, а просто
but simply because this algorithm already existed in the noosphere and truly could be read down.
можно было считать. Ну а следующий вопрос.
Well, the next question arises.
Можете считать алгоритмику,
If you can read down the algorithmics, and this algorithmics leads to some trouble,
то можно ли
can you change it?
изменить? Ну, об этом вот я уже
Well, I've already talked about this. This is Herzen.
далее еще
Further, they still don't let us know history. The Russian government, as a reverse providence, improves for the better, not for the future, but the past. And in general, the ruling elite of any society does not need a reliable history.
достоверная история не нужна. Ей необходим
It
исторический
needs a historical myth that allows it to justify its right to power and the duty of the rest of society to obey.
всего остального общества подчиняться. Ну, в общем, просто
Just
посмотрите
look at what has happened even throughout our
на
life.
протяжении нашей жизни. Сейчас задача
Now the task of historians is to spit on the Soviet era with truth, untruth,
правдой, неправдой,
falsification of data,
умолчание,
silence about some events, but in any case to spit on the Soviet era.
и оплевать советскую эпоху. Советская эпоха характеризовалась
The Soviet era was characterized by the fact
было до 17
that everything that was before 1917 was presented as an unquestionable negative and evil, from which the Bolshevik Party, on the basis of Marxism and Leninism, delivered the broad masses of people.
И если смотреть в
And if you look into the historical past, then in general, it has always been the case that the ruling elite, one way or the other, falsified history, offering this or that cultic historical myth.
вот наш,
Here are our days.
ну, этот жанр
Well, this is a genre when there is a picture on a black field.
на поле, а на черном
And on a black field besides the picture, there is some kind of inscription. Now on the internet, they are called demotivators.
А если картинка на ярко-синем,
And if the picture is on a bright blue background, then these are motivators.
демотиватор, связан
This here is an American demotivator related to the events of the 11th of September 2001.
Пентагона после пожара.
This is the Pentagon building
Американцев
after the
задается
fire.
вопросом, а где самолет?
Someone from the Americans asks the question, where is the plane?
Здесь должны
That is,
лежать
if any Boeing flew here, there should be the wreckage of a Boeing.
обшивка самолета.
Moreover, if the outer layer of the aircraft is a thin aluminium alloy, it can really burn out. Then frames, engines, something else should remain. All this is rather large, and this is absent here. In addition to this, the destruction zone is quite narrow, but the wingspan of the aircraft is about 40 meters. This is absent.
Порядка 40 метров. Нету. Это вот то, что я уже
This is what I showed you yesterday.
Вот вид острова Утойя. Если
Here is a view of Utoya Island.
то вот эти вот
If Breivik is running along the shore,
может в них
then these guys here are not visible to him. He can't shoot them.
внизу воды и даже их видит. Он вооружен.
If he runs along the water's edge and even sees them, he's armed with the wrong weapon to be guaranteed to hit them.
В кустах он опять не может стрелять.
And if one of them hides behind the bushes, he again cannot shoot.
Как он за полтора
And this here is the official route of Breivik.
67 человек.
How he killed 67 people in an hour and a half on Utoya.
Словах, то мы можем поверить во
If we believe in words, then we can believe anything.
соображалку,
If we turn on the brain and start thinking, that is, drawing a cartoon, then we can see a lot of things that do not fit into the official version of events.
в официальную версию событий. А если мы еще
And if we are also armed with the apparatus of probability theory and mathematical statistics,
то у нас может возникнуть
then we may have even more questions in relation to any unreliable historical myth,
недостоверному историческому мифу,
because the information reported in it generates other statistics, and not those that could have been or were.
статистики, а не те, которые могли бы быть или были. Дальше встает вопрос
Further, the question arises about the descriptive categories with which we can describe the real historical process.
исторический процесс. Но там
Usually how? With the accuracy of the faceless crowd people and the leader.
вождя. И такая тенденция, она
And such a tendency, it is really supported by the mass media throughout history to the present
по
time.
настоящее время. Потому что если вы
Because if you turn to what was before 1917, the king is God's anointed, and there is a crowd of more or less loyal subjects.
анализируем сейчас современные СМИ,
Now we are analyzing the modern mass media.
должен отдуваться
In the US, the president should take the rap for everything.
а за все должен
In Russia, lately, Putin should take the rap for everything,
вроде как не
and others allegedly have nothing to do with it.
следующий уровень.
The next level of description.
В общем, в более сложном
In a more complex version, a group of comrades appears who directly interact with the leader, the Tsar and his entourage, or as in our modern version, Putin and the cooperative Ozira, and all the rest have nothing to do with it.
Путин и кооператив озера. А все остальные опять ни при чем. Следующий
The next level,
точностью до
with the accuracy of certain social groups.
вот марксистская версия истории это история борьбы
The Marxist version of history.
есть место,
This is a history of class struggles.
которые делают
There is a place for personalities who make history and who are made by history,
сподвижники и
associates of these personalities, and there are classes that carry their specific interests there and fight for the realization of them.
борются за их реализацию.
But if you go deeper, then the crowd is not capable of self-organization.
Толпа не способна к самоорганизации.
Classes and other social groups emotionally react to some events, but in some cases it can be traced that within social groups there are, in fact, mafia groupings that generate either political parties or church orders and some intrasocial formations, which in relation to the crowd act as an organizing and directing force. Such an approach leads to the fact that orders and other political mafias that hide from societies have their own legalized periphery. They generally do not act on their own, but they pursue quite determined political objectives that far from always coincide with these or those class interests. But class interests are used to realize these political objectives. This leads to the concept of conspiracy in history, and the analysis of conspiracies shows that on the one hand, there is a certain group of conspirators, but there is an intellectual trust that organizes this conspiracy. And in general, it turns out that descriptive categories form a kind of ordered structure. And everything at the end of the day leads to the fact that humanity in some way interacts with God and his opponents, interacts with extraterrestrial civilizations. But history, being in these or those worldview positions, does not see much of this and does not want to see. Because if one of the historians touches on this theme, then the officialdom will be against it. Well, for example, the Red Wheel by Solzhenitsyn. If you read it, knowing or studying history for yourself, and not in order to pass a test or an exam, then it will become quickly clear that Solzhenitsyn knows what to keep silent about, because if he talks about this, then he will not be an outstanding writer, not an outstanding historian. And if he keeps silent about it, then there will be forces that are interested in just such a display of historical events. And, accordingly, so that everything would be good and that this view of history would sufficiently become widespread, a cult is built. Solzhenitsyn is a great writer, the Soviet of the nation, and so on and so forth. Although, in reality, he knew what to keep silent about in order to get publicity and prosperity, and he got it. Well, there was Vasily Osipovich Kluchevsky, one of the most intelligent historians of Russia in the second half of the 19th, early 20th centuries. Here are some of his aphorisms. In the quality of the content of history as a separate science, a special branch of scientific knowledge serves the historical process. That is, not a set, not a sequence of successive facts tied to time, but a process that has a certain internal dynamics, its own driving forces, and in which humanity, each nation, interacts with the environment. If we talk about the history of people, then not only with the natural environment, but also with the external political environment. So the story of the Titanic and other events, they show that history is really algorithmic. And in it, everything is conditioned by cause-effect relationships. We are now talking about this from the standpoint of the theory of algorithmics, theory of governance, programming. That is, from the standpoint of those disciplines that did not exist at the time of Ключевский. But if objective phenomena somehow exist and a person sees them, then he must also somehow describe them. And here Ключевский has an aphorism. The regularity of historical phenomena is inversely proportional to their spirituality. So, regularity in science is understood in such a way that if you create some conditions, these conditions affect something, and the result will be programmed by the impact of these conditions. That is, the repeatability of the result in the presence of certain conditions. According to this aphorism, history should repeat itself, and it repeats itself, but its repeatability is conditioned by spirituality. That is, if the spirituality of a society does not change, and spirituality is what I called psychodynamics. If the algorithmics of psychodynamics does not change, then history repeats itself like 2 and 2, always and everywhere. If psychodynamics changes, Nraviousness, the world understanding of society changes, the algorithmics of psychodynamics changes. And accordingly, something will be repeated, but something will change. And if there are very strong changes in psychodynamics, then the historical past will not repeat itself, but some new result will be obtained. And indeed, in the term spirituality, which was used by Ключевский in those days, the nraviousness of the comprising the era people, the creative potential of all of them, are hidden. And as a result, Ключевский asks the question, what do all these phenomena mean? What meaning in this chaos? This is the task of historical study. We cannot grope in the dark. We must know the power that guides our private and public life. That is, Ключевский posed the question of how the objective laws, to which the life of people is subordinate, are manifested in history. And the past must be known not because it has passed, but because, passing, it could not remove its consequences. And if we want a future, then we must ponder on what in the present is conditioned by the past and how, and we must egress from the cyclics of repetition of the same bad events that really take place in history. Well, there is such a thought that the present, this is a time when, by meaningful actions, it is possible to change the automatically inevitable future if we know the consequences of the past. And in this connection, pay attention to the fact that history has practically no memory of beneficial prophecies about the future. All prophecies about the future that history has preserved, these are prophecies of disasters. Why? But the answer to the question why cannot be understood if you do not know all this. This picture was also seen yesterday. There are objective laws. And there are governorial objective laws. Now, if we consider a situation where we have a certain self-governed object, and in relation to it, we perform control functions, and control functions assume that if the process of self-governance of this object flows somehow not the way that we would like, then we can intervene. Humanity is a self-governed system. There is the noosphere, a higher level of governance. There is God, the Almighty, the highest level of governance. And if we self-govern in a certain mode, and this very mode of our activity causes displeasure at higher levels, then a reaction is inevitable. The simplest reaction is to notify those who govern at our level that the process is heading towards catastrophe. If they accept this for fulfillment, somehow change the character of governance, then the catastrophe does not occur, and the prophecy of disasters becomes irrelevant. If they do nothing, then psychodynamics operates the algorithmics that leads to the catastrophe, and the catastrophe is realized. But if you don't know the theory of governance, then many things in history will simply be not understandable for you. It will be some kind of mystical bad luck or mystical good luck. For some reason, some are always lucky, while others, for some reason, are always unlucky. Britain has always been lucky from the 15th century. Russia has always been unlucky. In the primitive version, remember the film We'll Live Till Monday, the low-mark student says, and in general, Russia, after Peter the Great, had no luck with the Tsars. This is my personal opinion. Why was she unlucky? And you can't understand this if you don't master all of these tools. Well, since all societies are governed in some way, each person is also governed in some way, then if the historian is governarially illiterate, then he will not see governance where it is, and will write a lot of nonsense presenting the facts. But the facts will be reliable. But the conception of the historical past presented to society by him will be false or inherently deceitful. Therefore, you need to turn to how to form your governarial literacy. That is, we turn to the sixth group of objective laws, governarial objective laws. In 1991, the Institute of the Academy of Sciences for US and Canadian Studies commissioned the Faculty of Applied Mathematics of Processes of Governance of Leningrad University for a research work on the theme Interaction of Great Powers for the period before 2005. The order implied that some interaction models would be drawn up on the basis of the game theory apparatus, and on their basis it would be possible to calculate the politics, evaluate the variance. The apparatus of game theory is one of the directions in probability theory and mathematical statistics. And in the United States in general, it is used for governance towards conflicts, for their modeling. Well, in general, it turns out that, roughly speaking, there are subjects whose behavior is random, and so they somehow interact there. Who will win? But in the interaction, the behavior of subjects, is it random or not random? Each subject strives for some objectives. From where and how these objectives come is the question. In what ways, by what means can these objectives be realized? That is, it turns out that there is a certain level of modeling which turns out to be higher than the apparatus of game theory. And since it became clear that on the basis of the apparatus of game theory, the tasks, works set by the orderer cannot be performed, then the question arose of what works higher than the level of the apparatus of game theory and how. The result is the sufficiently general theory of governance. The sufficiently general theory of governance is characterized by the fact that it contains these concepts here. The apparatus of game theory. This is one of the applied directions of probability theory and mathematical statistics. First of all, the concept of the entire function of governance was introduced. The entire function of governance is a sequence of actions, the beginning of which gives the identification of a factor of the environment that puts pressure on the psyche and causes the need for governance, and which ends either with the achievement of the intended objectives in relation to this factor, or with a return to the first point. The entire function of governance can be described in varying degrees of detailedness. But if you understand what an entire function of governance is, then you can deploy from it a theory of governance towards anything, with the degree of detailedness that you need. Stages of the entire function. Identification of the factor of the environment that puts pressure on the psyche, causes discomfort, and thereby causes the need for governance. Setting of objectives in relation to this factor, that is, what you want. Further, the questions arise. How to achieve this? How to achieve this is to build a conception of governance. Further, the implementation of the conception of governance in life. The organization of governance in accordance with the conception. In the course of governance, the monitoring of the course of the process. Perhaps it will be necessary to improve the conception, and everything ends with the achievement of the intended objectives and the release of resources that were used in the process of governance, or, if the objectives are not achieved but you are still alive, then you return to the first point and again engage in the setting of objectives, building a new conception, and continuing to act. The sovereignty of any state is always governance according to the entire function. If there is no governance according to the entire function, then there is a loss of sovereignty to a greater or lesser measure. What is lost? How is lost? These are already questions of historical concretics. Since information and algorithmics are recognized as objective categories of being, and not as a product of the subjectivism of this or that person, then any process in nature, in society, in technology can be interpreted as a process of self-governance that flows within the boundaries of hierarchically higher in relation to it, encompassing governance, or as a process of governance. Everything is described by one and the same terminology. Further, the concept is introduced. There are many words, but there are no superfluous ones. Stability of the object of governance in terms of predictability of behavior under the impact of the external environment, internal changes, and governance as such. Briefly, stability in terms of predictability of behavior. So, stability in terms of predictability of behavior, this is a more general understanding of stability than the understanding of stability that is accepted in the majority of the branches of technology, in natural scientific disciplines, in theoretical mechanics, in the theory of automatic control. In what is the essence? Well, let's say we have a certain parameter. This is the time axis. This parameter is almost unchanging. It fluctuates within some limits, and at the moment t1, some impact is exerted on the object, and it goes out of this mode here, and then the question arises, what will happen to it? Now, if there is something like this is stability. If there is something like this, or this is like this is also understood as stability with some reservations. But if there is something like this over here, or this over here, with an increasing amplitude, it is understood as instability in different forms. Well, a simple, understandable example, we take a piece of paper, fold an airplane. Well, a simple task. If you do this with the airplane, will it fly out the window? If you throw it in the direction of the window, then generally, a symmetrically made airplane will fly out the window. Maybe not the first time. You will introduce some corrections, but it will fly out. And if you try to throw a piece of paper in the same way, what will happen to it? Well, first of all, it is unlikely to reach the window, and you can hardly predict the place on the floor where it will fall. Why? Well, because the picture of flows around the airplane is unchanging. It is stable, and you can, on this basis, know that the airplane, with a prescribed trajectory, in general will not go just anywhere. Maybe there will be some deviations from the ideal trajectory, but still, everything will be more or less predictable. But if you throw a sheet of paper, then flows, vortices, break off from the edges of the sheet of paper. They break off in an unpredictable, random way, and therefore the page falls anywhere. That is, the airplane, according to the classics, is stable, but the page is unstable. And when the leaves of the trees fall from a tree in autumn, then you also don't know where they will fall, because the flow pattern is unpredictable. Well, today we were on the beach and saw a hydrofoil boat flying over there, far on the horizon. Have you seen one? A hydrofoil boat is like this. But there is one caveat. These are little submerged wings. That is, they are located near the surface of the water. And now the wing scheme is designed in such a way that if the wing floats, the lift on it drops and it begins to sink. If it sinks, then the lift on it grows and it floats up. And thanks to this circumstance, a boat on low submerged hydrofoils is hydrodynamically stable and can fly above the water surface. Here what is important is that the surface of the water is smooth. But if there is no smooth surface and there is disturbance, then imagine hitting a wave at the speed of 30 to 40 kilometers per hour and higher. When diving, some have had the experience of flopping on the water with their tummy. It's unpleasant. And here in general, it is the same, only for ship structures. In general, the ship will be severely damaged, but there is also a wish to fly over the agitated sea. How to do it? To fly over the agitated sea, you need to drive the wings deep and raise the body high. Will we fly? Not a chance. Deeply submerged hydrofoils do not have this quality of hydrodynamic stability. And if you simply lengthen the struts, it will not fly. It may come out onto the wings and immediately flop down with its belly, nose or stern. This is already the second question. But if you put a whole bunch of sensors here that will determine the position of the ship, the hull above the water, the position of the wings, roll, trim, and so on, and then set another system of governance, then you will fly both over a smooth water surface and over an agitated sea. The main thing is that the distance between the tops and bottoms of the wave is less than the height of the struts. This is an example of the fact that the task of stability in terms of predictability of behavior of an object has been solved. And thanks to the solution of the task of stability in terms of predictability of the behavior of the object, it is possible to provide stable governance towards an object that is unstable in the usual sense of this term. Another illustration on the theme of the correlation between the conventional understanding of stability and stability in terms of predictability of behavior. Acceleration of free fall, a ball in a bowl. Well, it is clear that if we take it out of the state of equilibrium, then it will vibrate and in the end stop here. Right? And now let's do the opposite. A steel dome, on it a steel ball. Here is the same acceleration of free fall. What will happen? If the dome is very large, then by strength of the fact that there are some micro roughnesses and so on the surface of a seemingly spherical dome, you can find such a place that the ball will not go anywhere.
что шарик никуда
But
не
if the
денется.
size ratio
А
is
вот если
approximately the
соотношение
same, what will
размеров
happen?
примерно такое, чего будет? А вот и
This
нет.
is an outdoor view,
Потому что
and if we
это
make a
вид
cut,
наружный.
then we can see such a
А если
thing.
мы сделаем разрез, то мы можем увидеть вот
This is the
такую
body of the
вещь.
dome.
Это
Under the
вот
dome, we have a hidden magnet.
тело купола. А под куполом у нас спрятан магнитик.
This is about the fact that stability in terms of predictability of behavior, this is a subjective phenomenon.
Это явление субъективное. Вот, когда я
So when I
нарисовал
drew a
купол и
dome
на
and
нем
a
шарик,
ball on it,
возникли разные
different
мнения.
opinions
Вам
arose.
сказал,
The
что
first,
останется
it will remain at the
если
top if the
размеры
dimensions are
большие,
large,
и он прав.
and this is true.
И вы правы по-своему.
The second, that it will slide there, provided that there are no restraining factors. But can there be restraining factors? There can be. Here is a restraining factor, a magnet. And it will not go anywhere if the ball is steel. And then there is a magnet, it will not go anywhere from the force field of the magnet. And if we replace the steel ball with a copper or plastic one, then again the effect will be like this. This is an illustration on the theme that the concept of stability in terms of predictability of behavior, under the impact of the external environment, internal changes in the object, and governance as such. It combines both objective and subjective factors. And what for one person is unpredictable, for another person is easily and simply predictable. Why? This is a different question. And the concept of stability in terms of predictability is closely connected with the creative potential of an individual. Because, in general, stability in terms of predictability, it arises as the realization of creative potential in the course of the process of governance. Further, in the sufficiently general theory of governance, the concept of three methods of governance is introduced. Well, the structural method of governance is very understandable for everyone. A structure is a system of governance. It consists of a set of functionally specialized elements. They are connected to each other by channels of informational exchange, energy exchange, and everything else. And the system functions in a certain way so as to provide the desired for us governance. It is possible to operate in a structureless way, but it is not possible everywhere, and the concept of supersystem is introduced. A supersystem is a plurality of elements, each of which self-governs on the basis of that information and algorithmics which is in its memory. They can exchange information and algorithmics with each other, form some kind of interconnections in the process of their own self-governance on the basis of the information and algorithmics that are in the memory of each of them. In supersystems, two more methods of governance are possible. Structureless method of governance. The structureless method of governance is expressed in the fact that we pass a certain informational module through the supersystem. The elements of the supersystem react to this information as to an external factor of the environment, but they react in the process of self-governance in accordance with the information and algorithmics that they have in their memory. And it may turn out that as a result of the passage of this informational module, a certain number of elements will generate a structure that will carry out some process of governance. What is the principal difference? With the structural method of governance, the structure is created before it begins to function precisely as a system of governance. And in the structureless method of governance, the structure arises in the process of self-governance of the elements. And if you are able to assess the probability that the structures you need will arise, that is, to solve the task of stability in terms of predictability of a certain subplurality of elements in the supersystem, then you can govern in a structureless way. You distribute addresslessly information in the supersystem in the mode for all. Someone will accept, someone will not accept some element. Some of those who have accepted this information will react to it, some will not. But there is a non-zero chance that one or more structures will emerge in the supersystem that will fulfill the desired by you conception of governance. In order for them to implement this conception of governance, you must take care in advance that there is information and algorithmics. Maybe it will be distributed in different fragments over different elements, but that it is in the supersystem. And then, reacting to this informational module, some plurality of elements will generate certain structures and everything will be fine. Well, then it turns out that structural governance in the life of society is usually born from structureless governance in situations where objectives retain their significance and are stable. Well, to all appearances, the first army was not created as a structure. But at first, there was a people's militia. But the need for defense led to the fact that the people's militia was not completely disbanded, and those who had the corresponding skills, they formed a structure which was then reproduced as an army. The situation is much the same with fire brigades. But in general, structureless and structural governance, they can solve the same tasks in life. Well, the simplest example is a bus with a conductor. A conductor is a structure. What tasks does it solve? Sell tickets, collect money, give change. If someone asks about stops, the conductor is usually able to tell you where, what, and how. We liquidate the conductor as a position, set up cash desks. The same tasks are solved by the entire random totality of passengers traveling on the bus. Then the question arises, which method is better? But what are the criteria? If you are interested in reliability, that is, all passengers travel with tickets, and guarantees that the conductor will give information about where who should get off, then the conductor is better. If you have commercial interests, then by eliminating the position of conductor, you get some cost savings in the form of his salary. But along with this, the number of bus hoppers increases, and you must increase the number of inspectors. We look at the same situation from the other side. Society as a whole must produce the paper from which the tickets are made. The ticket is received by the passenger, he gets off the bus and throws it, at best, into a trash can. You have the right to pose the question, should society waste natural labor resources in order to produce these tickets? Maybe it is more economically profitable on the scale of society as a whole to put all public transport on the budget and govern it somehow differently without these very commercial indicators. That is, to one and the same governorial question, different answers can be given depending on what you want and what level you are looking. Well, yet another variant is when two supersystems penetrate each other. Then, it seems, if we look from the position of one supersystem, here we have supersystem 1. And inside it, there is supersystem 2. The correlationship between them is such that each element of supersystem 2 belongs to supersystem 1. But not every element of supersystem 1 belongs to supersystem 2. But now suppose that supersystem 1 generates a certain structure, active or inactive, but deployed within the boundaries of supersystem 2. Now, if we look at this from the perspective of supersystem 2, then we may not see this structure. But if it starts working, then we will see that the elements of supersystem 2, seemingly independently of each other, randomly, take actions that turn out to be consistent and corresponding to a certain conception of governance. From the point of view of supersystem 2, the structure does not exist. From the point of view of supersystem 1, the structure exists. And when it's activated, it starts to work. This is governance on the basis of virtual structures. That is, depending on how you look, from one point of view there is no structure, and from another point of view there is a structure. And in large supersystems there is usually a combination of all three methods of governance. Well, this variant, this is those situations when, let's say, a foreign intelligence network is deployed in your state. They give the command, the agent network begins to engage in sabotage and terrorist activities, although before the command was given they seemed to be ordinary citizens of your country who did not stand out in any way and did not differ from others. Here we have the entire function of governance described in stages. I have already named the stages. In principle, everything is on the internet, therefore it is not necessary to write down. Further, theory of governance presupposes an understanding of what an enclosed system is. Moreover, here one must understand that the words enclosed and isolated are not synonyms. That is, enclosure is understood as the interaction of the system of governance and the object of governance, which are connected to each other by chains of feed-forward and feedback lines. Feed-forward lines go from the system of governance to the object of governance, and feedback lines go from the object of governance to the system of governance. This linkage here between the system of governance and the object of governance, this is an enclosed system.
Дальше начинаются особенности. Вот в достаточно общей теории управления
Then the particularities begin. In the sufficiently general theory of governance, some of the feed-forward lines go into the environment with which the enclosed system interacts,
часть обратных связей
and some of the feedback
из
lines
среды
from the environment go to the
идут в
system of
систему
governance.
управления. Ну, специалисты
Well,
по
many specialists in
автоматическому
automatic
теории
control
управления
theory
многие лезут
climb the
на
wall from such a
стенку от такого
definition,
определения,
since in their versions of
поскольку
theory of
в
governance,
их версиях
feed-forward
теории
lines do not go
управления
into the
прямые
environment,
связи
and
не
feedback
идут в
lines do not go
среду,
from the
и
environment to the
обратные
system of
связи не
governance.
идут из среды в систему управления. Если обратиться даже к
Even if we
примитивным
turn to
практикам
primitive practices of
управления,
governance,
типа
such as
вождения
driving a car,
автомобиля,
before changing lanes or some kind of maneuver,
перестроением
you
или
indicate a
каким-то
turn
маневром,
by
вы
turning on the corresponding
обозначаете
signal lights.
поворот включением соответствующих сигнальных лампочек. Это выдача
This is the issuance of
информации
information
во
to the
внешнюю
external
среду о
environment
ваших
about your
намерениях. То
intentions.
есть это прямые
That is,
связи,
these are
которые
feed-forward
выходят во
lines that go
внешнюю
to the
среду.
external environment.
Если вы собираетесь маневрировать,
If
вы
you are going
будете
to
смотреть,
maneuver, you also
какие
look
машины,
what cars,
где,
where, what lights are on in them.
какие лампочки на
That
них
is,
горят.
some information
То
from the
есть
environment through the
какая-то
feedback lines
информация из
enters the
окружающей
system of
среды по
governance.
цепи обратных связей поступает в систему управления.
Well, along with
Наряду с
this,
этим имеет
there is
место
an interaction of the object of governance
управления
with the
с
environment.
средой.
This is stability in terms of
Устойчивость в
predictability
смысле
under the impact
предсказуемости
of the
под
external environment.
воздействием внешней среды. Но здесь же в объекте
But here some
управления
changes
тоже
also take
происходят
place in the
какие-то
object of governance.
изменения. Если тот же автомобиль расходует топливо,
If the same
на
car
каком-то
consumes
этапе вы
fuel,
должны
then
подумать
at
о
some
том,
stage
где
you should think about
ближайшая
where the
заправка.
nearest gas station is,
Поскольку если
because if the gas pump dries up somewhere on the road,
засохнет,
then you will have some troubles,
где-то на дороге,
including
то
possibly with the
возникнут
brains in the
некоторые
car who don't
неприятности,
understand what happened.
в том
This
числе
can
и,
also be.
возможно, с мозгами автомобиля, которые не поймут, что произошло. Такое тоже может быть. Ну а то, что под
Well, the
воздействием
fact that under the
управления
impact of governance, it is also necessary to watch how the car behaves,
автомобиль, это
this
тоже
is also understandable.
То есть все, что касается полной функции
That
управления,
is, everything related to the entire function of governance, stability in terms of predictability, methods of governance, it is in some way connected with the processes occurring during the interaction of an enclosed system with its environment.
с окружающей ее средой. Дальше существуют три схемы
Further, there
управления.
exist three schemes of governance.
Программная схема
Program scheme of
управления.
governance.
В ней есть только прямые связи.
It contains
Контур
only
обратных
feed-forward
связей
lines.
отсутствует.
The contours of feedback lines are
Фактически, вот
absent.
программная схема управления, она
But factually, the
реализуется
program
в
scheme of
машинных
governance
автоматах.
is implemented in automatic
Есть
washing
некий таймер,
machines.
он считает время, и в
There is a
зависимости от
certain
того,
timer,
какая секунда
it counts the
идет,
time, and depending on which second passes, the program performs these or those operations.
барабан
It turns the drum,
заливает или
fills and
сливает
drains the
воду,
water,
или
or
крутит
turns the
барабан
drum
так,
so that it
чтобы он
works
работал в
in the
режиме
centrifuge mode
центрифуги,
and
если
dries the
сильно.
laundry.
Программная
The program
схема
scheme of
управления
governance is primitive.
примитивна, но тем не менее
But,
есть
nevertheless,
ситуации, в которых она
there are
вполне
situations in which it is quite functionally
нет
operable,
надобности с тем, чтобы городить огород с
and there is no
обратными
need to make an
связями
unnecessary
усложнением
fuss with
системы
feedback
управления.
lines and complication of the system of
Программные
governance.
схемы управления
But for the
требуется,
program system
чтобы
of governance,
условия,
it is
в
required that
которых
the
она
conditions in which it is
реализуется,
implemented
соответствовали
correspond to
тем,
those
на
for which
которые
it is
она
designed.
рассчитана. Если происходит
If something
что-то
unpredictable, unforeseen
непредсказуемое,
happens, then there may be curiosities and there may be tragedies. Here is one such curiosity: a competition in ship modeling, a missile boat with programmed governance at the starting line. The task: go the distance and get into the gate. Well, on the way, it also has to make a volley of 4 missiles. the boat breaks down on the way and loses its speed. The wind begins to turn it, and the boat changes its position so that the table of the panel of judges is in the shooting sector. At this time, according to the program which continues to work, the moment of a rocket salvo comes. The first rocket is deployed and flies over the heads of the members of the panel of judges. By the time the second rocket appeared, the entire panel of judges was under the table. This is a breakdown of the program. There was no means to stop it, but in fact there should have been feedback lines which, if the boat stops moving, stop the operation of the program. Further, the program adaptive scheme of governance. The program adaptive scheme of governance includes both feed-forward lines and feedback lines, but it is characterized by the fact that the algorithmics of governance in it is generally unchanging. Or it can switch from one mode to another. Well, like in cars, the power system eco, a minimum of power and ecology at a maximum, or sport, when the dynamics improve, the environmental performance deteriorates. But nevertheless, program adaptive schemes of governance, in all variants, they react only to the changes that have already taken place. If this is some kind of climate control, then the temperature drops, the stove turns on, and it becomes warm. Well, you see, there are such situations when a program adaptive scheme of governance is not able to use the full potential that an enclosed system as a whole possesses. Why? Some changes take place. The sensors do not have zero sensitivity. Until the changes exceed the sensitivity threshold of the sensors will show 0. Further, the sensors transmit information. The performance speed of the information transmission system may also be finite, even if we use, for example, Skype. Then actually, sound and video reach the addressee more slowly than in analogous systems. Further, the system of governance needs some time to process information, to work out a governing impact. Then the governing impact, through the chains of feed-forward lines, falls on the executive bodies of governance. They also need time to operate, and in general it turns out that even if the system works out the correct governorial decision, it is in a certain way delayed. And while this time of lagging is flowing, the object of governance can go beyond the acceptable limits for deviation from the ideal mode. What to do in such a case? In such cases, you can go to the predictor-corrector scheme of governance. The predictor-corrector scheme of governance works out the governing impact, not only taking into account the already accomplished events. In the course of its work, the prognostics of the behavior of the environment, the behavior of the object, is carried out, and the governing impact is worked out taking into account this prognostics, primarily on its basis. That is, a certain number of feedback lines are closed not through the accomplished past, but through the prognosed future. How does the predictor-corrector scheme work? Here is one of the anecdotes. Firefighters are playing dominoes. They shuffle the bones, assemble them, they look. We are goats. They shuffle the bones, collect them, look. You are goats. The game itself as such does not take place. No one knocks on the table with their knuckles. This is an anecdotal example of how the predictor-corrector scheme works. But in some situations, its proactive effect can prevent big troubles. That is, if you as a politician expect aggression, then the deployment of force groups near the borders, in some cases, can sober up the potential aggressor, and you will not have the need to wage a war as such. I have already told about the methods of governance. In general, it turns out that the toolkit of the sufficiently general theory of governance is a necessary tool in order to analyze current politics, analyze history, and if it is not there, or you don't master it, then in history there is much that you will not see, or you will see but will incorrectly understand, or perceive it not at all as a social historical phenomenon. But you will see in this a play of some elemental forces, or a convergence of chance happenings.
Ну а дальше возникает вопрос о том, как
Well, and then questions arise about how the predictor-corrector scheme works, and in general, the task of stability in terms of predictability of behavior is solved.
Вот издревле известна метафора древо познания.
The metaphor tree of knowledge has been known since ancient times. Moreover, the tree of knowledge in the tradition is not a pine tree, but an apple tree. Why? Because in ancient times there was no such concept as an algorithm, and drawing a branching block scheme of an algorithm was problematic. But the crown of the apple tree, it really branches, and among other things, the apple tree bears some kind of fruit. And further the question arises how to interpret the metaphor. This interpretation is proposed. The soil, this is objective reality, texts and other monuments of the culture inherited from past eras. The roots of the tree of knowledge, this is the methodology of cognition. That is, how we, from the flow of all information which is in the world, single out something that is addressed to us, how we comprehend it, and as a result we get new knowledge and new skills which in the past were not in the culture of society and which we also did not possess. In general, all our activity is governance towards something. In engineering, in construction, this is governance towards technologies, creation of technologies. Medicine is governance towards the course of the disease, or the governance towards the process of healing of the organism. These are two different things. Therefore, the first product of the methodology of cognition, this is a certain sufficiently general, in the sense of universality of application, theory of governance. Well, we have become acquainted with its main provisions, although in general, the theme sufficiently general theory of governance is a lesson for at least one semester, every week by theme. There is something to talk about and something to show both in theory, in abstractionism, and in the practice of activity. The crown of the tree, this is applied scientific discipline.
Граница ствола и каждой из ветвей –
The
это
boundaries
то,
of the
что в
trunk and
технике
each of the
называется
branches are
метрологией.
what in
В
technology is
самом
called
широком
metrology.
понимании метрология – это учение о том, как абстракции
In
некой
the broadest
теории,
sense,
ее
metrology is the study of
терминологический и
how
символьный
abstractions of a
аппарат
certain theory,
связаны
its
с
terminological
реальной
and symbolic
явлениями жизни.
apparatus, are connected with real
Если
phenomena in
метрологии
life.
нету, то деятельность невозможна. Если
If there
вы
is no
ловите
metrology,
любую
then the
научную
activity is
теорию
impossible.
на том, что какие-то
If you
ее
catch any
понятия
scientific theory
невозможно
on the
связать
fact
с
that some
объективной
of its concepts
реальностью,
cannot be connected
либо
with objective
эта
reality,
связь неопределенна,
or
может
this
быть
connection
такой,
is not
может быть
determined,
сякой, и вы
it
не
may be this,
контролируете
it may be
эту
that,
связь,
and
то
you do
есть не
not
можете
control this
задать ее
connection,
директивно,
that is, you cannot
то
set it
эта
directly,
теория
then
метрологически
this theory is metrologically
несостоятельна,
inconsistent.
она
It
что-то
explains something plausibly,
правдоподобно
but it is
объясняет,
impossible to use
но
it for the
пользоваться
solution
ею для
of practical
решения
tasks.
практических задач невозможно. Ну, один из примеров
Well,
это
one
теория
example is Gumilev's theory of
пассионарности
passionarity.
Что такое пассионарность? Если
What is
анализировать
passionarity?
его книгу
If you analyze his
«Этногенез и
book,
биосфера Земли»,
Ethnogenesis and
там есть
Biosphere of the
десяток
Earth,
определений
there are a dozen definitions of
пассионарности,
passionarity.
и все
They are
они
all
разные.
different.
Если
If we have this,
имеем
then it's
такое, то
impossible.
это невозможно. Дальше марксистская политэкономия.
Next,
Что такое
the Marxist political
необходимый
economy.
продукт и что такое
What is a
прибавочный
necessary
продукт,
product and what is a surplus product?
сказать невозможно
This is impossible to say
однозначно. Что
univocally.
такое необходимое рабочее время и что такое прибавочное
What is necessary
рабочее
labor
время,
time
тоже
and what is
невозможно
surplus labor
сказать.
time is also impossible to
Перенос
say.
стоимости со средств производства
The transfer
на
of value from
продукцию
means of
– это
production to
бухгалтерская
products
операция,
is an
которая
accounting operation
называется
called
амортизационное
depreciation charges,
отчисление. И она подчинена не каким-то объективным
and it is subject not to some
а
objective laws,
действующему в стране
but to the legislation in
законодательству,
force in the
которое
country,
определяет
which determines the
нормативы
standards
этих
for
самых
these very depreciation
амортизационных
charges.
отчислений. В работе
In his
«Экономические
work,
проблемы
Economic Problems of
социализма
Socialism in the
Сталин
USSR,
ткнул прямо
Stalin
в
pointed directly to the metrological
несостоятельность
inconsistency of the
политэкономии
political economy of
марксизма,
Marxism,
предложив
proposing that
экономистам
economists
отказаться от таких
abandon
терминов,
such terms as
как
necessary
необходимый
product
продукт,
and surplus product,
прибавочный продукт,
necessary labor time and
необходимое
surplus labor
рабочее
time,
время,
and
прибавочное
thereby
рабочее
Stalin
время.
himself buried
Тем
Marxism.
самым Сталин похоронил марксизм. Потому что если
Because if
метрологически
metrologically inconsistent political economy is a product of the methodology of dialectical materialism, and it is pseudo-scientific, then the following questions arise. What is wrong with the materialistic dialectic of Marxism?
А что не так в материалистической диалектике
Well, if everything there is not correct,
марксизма,
then in Marxism there remains only this
то
carrot.
тогда от марксизма остается только вот это вот
We will build
морковка.
socialism in which
Построим
everyone will be
социализм, в
fed,
котором
dressed,
все будут
live
сыты,
happily,
одеты,
and no one will
жить
parasitize on the labor of the
паразитируют
near and
на
far.
труде
Everything will be
ближнего
fine.
и дальнего. Все будет хорошо. Но реально
But really,
научно-методологическое
scientific methodological support
обеспечение
for the construction of
социализма
socialism,
марксизм не нес.
Marxism did not
И не
carry
несет до
and does not
настоящего
carry
времени.
up to the present
Поэтому
time.
социализм и коммунизм на основе марксизма не
Therefore,
могут быть
socialism and communism on the basis of Marxism
суверенными.
cannot be sovereign.
И то, что Советский Союз рухнул, это во
And the
многом
fact that the
следствие
Soviet Union collapsed is largely a consequence of the scientific inconsistency of Marxism.
Если обратиться к тому, что представляет
If we turn
наша
to what our
система
system of education
образования,
represents,
она не позволяет
it does not
пройти
enable
весь
us to
путь
go all the
от
way from
объективной
objective reality
реальности
to the results of
до
applying any scientific
результатов
theories in the practice of activity
применения
in the
каких-либо
solution of these or those
научных теорий
problems.
в практике деятельности в разрешении тех или иных проблем.
Our system of education offers a kind of herbarium of branches. It is somehow inserted into the curriculum, and then students are encouraged to jump from branch to branch, instead of going all the way from objective reality to a useful result. The metrology of the sufficiently general theory of governance and the methodology of cognition and creativity for the majority of people are closed themes. This is something that has no place in their psyche, well, and hence the quality of life.
Это то, чему нет места в их психике. Ну и отсюда и такое качество жизни.
If from the standpoint of the sufficiently general theory of governance, society is considered as a supersystem, then humanity is also a supersystem consisting of many supersystems, national cultures, peculiar in the cultural regard societies. Then further there arises the question of governance towards everything. And the answer to the question of governance towards everything leads to such a hierarchy. How can you impact society? Show brute force or use it. If the enemy is unable to provide effective resistance, then you will achieve the objective in relation to him. But here there is a saying of the type, I went for wool, I came back shorn. That is, the result is not guaranteed. If you don't feel like fighting, you can destroy your opponent's genetics. 2 or 3 generations will pass, and in general, there will be no one who can resist. The territory of the United States for whites was cleansed by means of fire water and some diseases. But in order to start the processes of biological degeneration in a civilized society, in general it is necessary to invest in something. Therefore, higher than genetics, finance. Since ancient times, there is a saying, where a mighty army will not pass, a donkey laden with gold will pass. Further is what was in the last picture, where this is. How to govern finances. What is a healthy lifestyle? What is not a healthy lifestyle? This is the system of education. It forms the mentality. That is, it gives some kind of factology and interpretation of this factology. This is the third priority of generalized means of governance. Ideologies, creeds, theories of science, all the factology that only exists in society. And if Nabulina was taught that in order to suppress inflation, it is necessary to raise the refinancing rate, and her intellect is disabled, or she, as they said in Soviet times, is hired by world imperialism, then she will do what she does, explaining it by saying that she, according to the theories accepted in economics, is fighting inflation by raising the refinancing rate. The fact that lending interest on the loan is the primary generator of inflation, she may not guess, due to the disconnection of her intellect and by strength of the fact that she studied other theories at the higher educational institution which do not talk about this. Well, the way ideology works is largely subordinated to the historical, algorithmic priority, to the psychodynamics that society carries. Psychodynamics, algorithmics of history, are expressed in chronology, and the chronological skeleton of history is the third priority too. But it has a very strong impact on society. Because if we accept the official version of historical science, that the Second World War began on September the 1st, 1939, then Poland appears as an innocent victim of the aggression of Nazi Germany. Questions arise about the role of the Soviet Union in the period of August 1939 and after September the 17th, 1939, when Soviet troops entered the territory of what was then Poland.
После 17 сентября 1939 года, когда советские войска вошли на территорию тогдашней Польши. А что было до того?
What happened before the 1st of September?
В период гражданской войны была и польская интервенция.
During the Civil War, there was also a Polish intervention.
Польской интервенции в советскую Россию.
During the Polish intervention, the territories of Western Belarus and Ukraine were seized from Soviet Russia. Therewith, Lithuania was formed at about the same time, and Vilnius was not the capital of Lithuania, but the Polish city of Vilna. The capital of Lithuania was Kaunas. And if you remember what happened in September 1938, then, in September 1938, the so-called Munich conspiracy took place, when Hitler and the leaders of France and England met in Munich. And France and England, in violation of their allied obligations in relation to Czechoslovakia, gave up Czechoslovakia to the mercy of Germany. Poland and Hungary joined the process of destruction of Czechoslovakia, and, accordingly, if the Second World War is counted from September the 1st, 1939, we will get one history of the Second World War. And if we count from the Munich Agreement, then another history. And Poland is no longer an innocent victim of aggression, but Poland is an accomplice in the Hitlerite coalition. And the fact that one ally decided to attack another, well, this is their internal affair. Also, if you turn to Finnish history, then you will find that Finland did not participate in the Second World War. But against the background of the Second World War, it had three wars. The first war is the Winter War of 39-40. According to the Finnish version, the Soviet Union attacked Finland. The Second War is a war against the Soviet Union against the background of the war between Hitler Germany and the Soviet Union, when they tried to regain what the Soviet Union, in their opinion, had torn away from them during the Winter War. And the third war is the expulsion of the Nazis from Finland, after it became clear that Germany was losing. But according to the official point of view of Finnish science, Finland did not participate in the Second World War. What took place? But the chronology was simply played with a little. The Winter War, the continuation of the war, and the cleansing of Finland from the Nazis. That's it. Therefore, the historical algorithmic priority, which is expressed in chronology, can do a lot in impacting society. Again, if we understand that the history of the present civilization began with a global geophysical catastrophe that destroyed the past civilization, then we will have many questions on the theme of why the past civilization perished and whether this catastrophe could have been prevented. If we say that the global flood is a myth and nothing like that happened, but just slowly from the biosphere to the present civilizedsness, then this is a completely different mentality, especially in the atheistic version, and different prospects in the future. But all this, it turns out to be a methodological priority. This is a teaching about how we cognize the world, that is, how we produce new knowledge. If we are able to produce it, then it is problematic for others to fool our heads, because we can process everything that is offered to us in the quality of truth and pose a counter-question. While insisting on this, do you yourself understand something or take us for idiots? And if we do not possess the methodology of cognition and creativity, then we find ourselves in the position of Winnie the Pooh, who is provided with consulting services by an owl. If with us there arises some problem, we go to the owl, and the owl, on the basis of his interests, tells us how to relate to this problem. Therefore, a society where gnoseological culture is at zero or close to zero, it, in principle, cannot be sovereign, because the methodology of cognition and creativity generates the conception of the historical process. It generates the entire factology of science and applied spheres of activity, the theory on which scientific activity is built. If we return to the thematics of yesterday's conversation, then the methodology of cognition and creativity leads to the canon in each branch of activity. If it is not there, it is impossible to reach the canon in a conscious order. You can solve all particular tasks, but the combination of these particular solutions will be such that you will suffer damage from the accompanying effects up to the point of destruction. Also, the methodology of cognition and creativity determines what happens at the genetic level, what a healthy lifestyle is, how it improves the genetics of a population, what is not a healthy lifestyle, and how it can be used against you in a hybrid war mode. Well, it is also clear that all weapons are also the result of creativity. Tactics are also the result of creativity. Strategy is the result of creativity. That is, if you possess this, you will master everything else. This is a question of time. If this is closed to you, then you are doomed to be a hostage of those who do possess it. Therefore, the irreversibility of the result of the use of means of governance grows from the sixth to the first, and the performance speed grows from the first to the sixth, because to gather an army and drive it somewhere, this, by historical standards, is an instant. But to change the culture in such a way that every graduate of the school understands what all this is and has mastered this, at least at a basic level that allows him to be a culturally consistent person, this takes time. Well, Rurik said correctly about culture. Culture is the expression of the entire people, or rather, of all peoples. Therefore, public social cooperation in the field of culture is always necessary for real success. But if the culture develops, then everyone masters the hierarchy of all 6 priorities of generalized means of governance. Now look at what culture is as an instrument of governance. In the ordinary understanding, culture is either something vague or knowledge and skills that are passed from generation to generation in addition to genetics. And if we look at culture from the point of view of theory of governance, then culture is an informational algorithmic system. It carries in itself a set of objectives, ordered by significance. It carries in itself some means of achieving objectives. In different cultures and different subcultures, these sets of objectives and means of achievement may not coincide. Hence the conflicts based on the non-coincidence of cultures, norms of behavior prescribed by them. And accordingly, if our society is multicultural, then in the field of formation of culture, we need a state policy which would make it possible to eliminate conflicts arising from the non-coincidence between the norms of different cultures. If this is not the case, then all kinds of clashes on national grounds, class contradictions, they are inevitable, and the loss of governance towards these processes by the state can always lead to another civil war, time of troubles, or simply the disappearance of certain peoples and their cultures. And by virtue of the fact that culture is an informational algorithmic system, it is also an instrument for governance towards life. But if there is a cultural policy of the society, of the state, then the same informational algorithmic system appears as an object of governance. That is, that which we can modify on the basis of our objectives so that they become a reality. There is such a document, U.S. National Security Council Directive 20/1, dated August the 18th, 1948. It is called Our Objectives with Respect to Russia. And this document, in 1948, outlined the dismemberment of the USSR, the liquidation of Soviet power, the creation of conditions that automatically ensure the military and economic weakness of what will happen after that, dependence of the post-Soviet states on the West in the sphere of education, economy, culture. And if you look at the world in which we live in general, all these tasks have been accomplished. Moreover, if we talk about how they were accomplished, then they were accomplished by the hands, the heads of the citizens of the USSR, with minimal participation in these processes by representatives of the Western Special Services and the Diplomatic Corps. That is, everything was realized by influencing the culture of Soviet society as an informational algorithmic system, as a result of which all this now has become a reality. If we consider cultures as informational algorithmic systems, then cultures are really variative by force of the fact that they are chock full of information. Culturologists are drowning in the abundance of this information. Well, if you are interested in the typology of cultures, then in general only 3 characteristic attributes are required. Here they are. The relation towards cognitive creative potential of the individual. In the right column there are variants. Indifferent. I want, I develop, I want, I destroy. No one has the right to tell me anything. This is my life. I do what I want. Another variant is to suppress everyone. This is, in the main, the task of the aggressors. Because if the cognitive creative potential of the victim of the aggression is suppressed, then he will always depend on you. You will explain the meaning of life and everything else. This is the policy of colonialism. The peoples of the colonies are second-class monkeys. They should be grateful that the colonialists provide them with a certain quality of life and allow them to live. All crowd elite societies suppress the majority, but preserve some minorities whose cognitive creative potential is realized. The norm in this table is highlighted in red, to ensure the development of all. And then it turns out that if we correlate with this here attribute, then Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin worked to ensure the development of everyone, and Hitler worked for something else, and Churchill worked for the same thing that Hitler worked for. Therefore, Churchill and Hitler are two peas. But there is no commonality between Stalin and Hitler. Next, we have the relation towards совесть and shame. Suppress everyone. Everyone should just be law-abiding and obedient to those who are higher in the hierarchy than they are. Another variant. Everyone is obliged to carry совесть and shame throughout their lives. Hitler. I freed the Germans from the chimera of совесть. Rabbis, совесть does not exist since nothing is said about it in the Torah. Stalin regularly, in his speeches at the Congress, recalls shame and совесть as necessary factors for the solution of these or those problems. If совесть and shame are active, and life somehow does not flow in the way that shame and совесть require, then further the question arises about the relation towards will. Because you can know what to do, совесть will demand that you do it or not do something else, but if there is no will, only complaints such as those of Taras Shevchenko will remain. The day comes, the night comes, head in hands I worry. Why does he not come, apostle of truth and knowledge? And it would be better not to worry, but to become an apostle of truth and knowledge. Then it could have been that in Ukraine there would have been no Maidan, and all these outrages that take place. In general, it turns out that if one of these is absent, then this is already not a human. No creative potential, zombies, no совесть and shame, also a zombie or a bestial, a humanoid animal, no will, then also a ficus in human form. In this connection, recall the film Kinzadza. We will not fly through the constellation Lyra or something there, because there they make cacti from us. That is, they give the bodily organization a form, corresponding to the level of development of the psyche. Well, the norm for society is highlighted in red in the table. Deviations from the norm in the past and present, these are the particularities of the historical development of these or those societies. Well, and further, you see that if this is now realized, there is creativity, shame, совесть, will, then the creative potential reveals the whole set of objective laws to which the life of people is subordinate. And it does it in general in all cultures. And since these are the same objective laws, and all governance must be subordinated to shame and совесть, then there can be no conflicts, intrasocial, not interpersonal, at least in a more or less adult society, interethnic. This is a different quality of life or civilization. Well, to all appearances, this objective law already existed, there is only an added arrow. The cultural policy of the state, which has an impact on all this, and governance, that forms the quality of life. That is, state governance, and this is the behavior of all people in society. Well, further, everything is also clear. All cultures develop as a result of the personal creativity of people. They also degrade, either as the result of creativity or as the result of biological degradation. The difference between development and degradation is objective, regardless of disputes about nravs. Time passes, and those who take the path of degradation, they perish, and those who did not take the path of degradation, they continue to live and develop. Therefore, Europe can talk a lot about tolerance, that we live wrong and they are right, but if they have entered the path of degradation and reached biological degradation, it is a matter of time before they disappear. Taken from some Israeli site. Someone is wondering, why is Moses here for 40 years, when Alexander the Great made a much longer journey in 11 years? What is behind this difference? Significantly, the inscription below is in Hebrew, and this is reassuring. There is such a point of view, that Moses and Susanne are two peas in a pod. And the result is such. Well, in general, there is such an understanding. It is in its essence idiotic, and in relation to both it is slanderous. But it implies that there is nothing serious in both cases. And there is such a point of view. Well, here is the earthly sphere, thimbles, on them the symbolism of the three Abrahamic religions, and this implies that there is a certain global game going on, a so-called game in quotation marks, and the objective is, in general, to dominate it. Well, it also fell so accurately that in this presentation this slide is number 33. The degree of initiation, well, for everyone, regardless of ethnicity, because above 33 there are only God's chosen ones. What is known about ancient Egypt? There were two capitals, In each capital there was a Greek college, 10 in the north and 10 in the south, headed by the 11th High Jrec. There was a pharaoh who was in charge of the state apparatus. Then the strangeness begins, because in books on history written in the 19th century, for example, Vodovozov primary school reader, that is in fact an educational program in self-study, it was said that everything in Egypt was subordinated to the Jretzhood. The film The Mummy, the plot is based on what? The High Jrec and the pharaoh are in conflict over a young lady. As a result, the High Jrec is buried alive, having been previously provided with insects that eat him alive. Well, you see, if in Egypt everything was subordinated to the Jretzhood, then this could not have been. If the High Jrec says to the pharaoh, "I need your concubine," then the pharaoh will respectfully bow down and give a gift to the High Jrec. How this will be externally furnished, this is another question. To say nothing of the fact that in order to be the High Jrec, an individual must not be a slave to his instincts. That is, the plot of The Mummy, it psychodynamically is objectively impossible. That is, it is a fake, the task of which is to create a deliberately false idea of how Egypt was ruled. If you look at the history and organization of governance in ancient Egypt at the time of the pharaohs, it turns out like this. Egypt was governed according to the predictor-corrector scheme. The task of Jretzli power is prognostics on the basis of identification of problems, the formation of a conception of governance, and moreover, there are two predictors. This suggests that one of them can be erroneous, both of them can be erroneous, and then the question arises as to how to get rid of the errors. Now, if the participants in both of them possess methodology of cognition and creativity in any form, then to them it should be clear that the difference of opinion is the result of the fact of different informedness, errors of intellectual activity, some psychological factors that cause these very errors. You can get to the bottom of all this, and if you get to the bottom, then, at the output of the process, which is called tandem in the diagram, a conception of governance will appear, free from the errors of the first two initial ones. All that is required is that people would master the methodology of cognition and creativity and would have no claim to personal copyright. That is, the position, "I am a great Jrec and you are all nothing." It does not work here. This is an immediate loss of governance. Further, the pharaoh is a program-adaptive module of the system of governance, and he governs it. He is responsible before the Jretzhood. But he is also initiated. Therefore, in the processes of working out of the conception, he also takes some part. Well, and further, the state apparatus will implement the conception, and this is already presented to society in the spirit according to the film The Mummy. The pharaoh is the head of everything, these are faithful servants, although in reality everything is the opposite way around. The Jretzli power is higher than the state power, and it is autocratic. And if you do not possess the methodology of cognition and creativity, then you will not find yourself there, although you can find yourself here being a complete fool. But in this case, someone will somehow manipulate you. And the first contenders to manipulate this is the Jretsli power. That is, the architecture of the statehood of Egypt during the time of the pharaohs, it is more consistent with the entire function of governance than any architecture of modern states, and accordingly, up to the level of Egypt of the time of the pharaohs, any state has to grow and grow. Nevertheless, Egypt with all its perfection is a thing of the past. Why is it a thing of the past? Because the Jretsul of Egypt were the first to understand this here. And, apparently, having become depraved, decided to achieve undivided world domination by realizing this here. That is, they produced a science, an ideology, which ensured the governance towards those who accept this in correspondence with their tasks. They also somehow mastered this. In general, they gave out this here. And this they imposed on the Jews in culture. And in order to impose it on the Jews in culture, it took 40 years to seal the ancient Jewish society in the desert, in isolation, creating for them their specific living conditions, during which this became the norm of their culture, the meaning of life. The Christians were offered the second part, that is, obey. And this turned out to be quite effective, because in the correspondence between Razanov and Florensky, there is such an episode. And in the end, there is only one question: do we believe the Bible or not? Do we believe the Apostle Paul or not? We are secondary, among other things. Israel, on the other hand, is the core of world history. This is the supreme will. If we humble ourselves, the joy of the last submission is in our souls. If we persist, we will reject the very Christianity for the sake of which we argued with Israel. That is, again, we will fall under the heel of Israel. The promises of God are immutable. We must ourselves complete our circle of submission to Israel. And truly, no matter how you take things, everything comes out the same. The Old Testament makes and relentlessly reiterates the promises of future world domination. To whom? To the Jews. And the New Testament, it by no means tells us, Christians, that this domination is now passing to us, Christians, but only calls to patiently bear our cross and promises for this salvation. One testament contradicts the other, not because both say one thing, however, but precisely because both say different things, and different things are addressed to different persons. And this deep and fundamental divergence of both testaments, reconciled with the high soaring of spiritual contemplation, as was the case with the Apostle Paul, unbearably cuts and burns our wingless and flabby consciousness. The Quran does not fit into this system of relations. Therefore, the task of eradicating the Quran from history, this is the main task of global politics pursued by the West. But this explains the entire historical past, well, factually, until 1917. Because after 1917, Bolshevism entered the political arena.
После 17-го года на политическую арену вышел большевизм. Вышел он.
It entered in the lexicon of Marxism,
но истинными марксистами.
But Trotsky and the Social Democrats of Europe were true Marxists.
Европы, а большевики
And the Bolsheviks were factually anti-Marxist from the beginning, since Marxism is a secular variant of this right here. That is precisely why political economy in Marxism is metrologically inconsistent. That is precisely why the methodology of cognition of dialectical materialism is defective, so that the following principle is realized. Everyone, to the measure of his understanding, works for himself, and to the measure of the difference in understanding, for those who understand more. Therefore, if the methodology of cognition of Marxism is defective, then the one who possesses a more perfect methodology of cognition can create a difference in the world understanding, and after that, the Marxists work for themselves to the measure of understanding, and to the measure of the difference in understanding for those who understand more and pursue different objectives. This concludes the current conversation. If you have any questions, then we can go to the questions. But all this is impossible to see if one does not look at history through the prism of the sufficiently general theory of governance. And the sufficiently general theory of governance cannot appear and cannot be understood if one does not possess the methodology of cognition and creativity, free from the defects of the dialectics of Marx, Hegel.
How can the Quran be eradicated?
The Quran is about 1,300 years ago. Muhammad was born in 570 according to the Christian chronology. The main thing that is unacceptable in the Quran is that usury is regarded as a variety of Satanism.
Does Islam refer to the Quran? Will it also be eradicated, or are they different things?
From their point of view, it should remain in the past, in much the same way as Hitlerism remained in the past. After the defeat of the Third Reich, Germany was subjected to denazification. And therefore, when now such a project as ISIS is developing, but ISIS would not have been able to develop without corresponding funding. But at the same time, ISIS is not worried about scientific technological progress, and accordingly, even if a caliphate arises with claims to become a world caliphate, the caliphate will be inferior in military economic potential to the United States, Japan, China, and it's doomed to military defeat in the event of a war. And further, the Quran is regarded as evil. In every history textbook, it is written that there was such an evil book, and accordingly, it does not arouse interest. That is, there is a project to eliminate Islam, since this here doctrine of buying up the world on the basis of usury, the Quran regards as Satanism.
At the moment, are there any higher educational institutions in which theory of governance is taught?
Maybe one of the teachers in some higher educational institutions recommends students to read it. But I don't know of any higher educational institutions at which courses in theory of governance are taught. Well, this here theory of governance. Because in the past, Vladimir Mikhailovich Zaznobin taught this at the Faculty of Applied Mathematics of Processes of Governance in Peterhof at the university. But after the death of Zubov, the course was discontinued. At the Agrarian University, after Viktor Alexeyevich Yefimov left the post of rector, the teaching of these courses was also stopped. Well, and the current rector simply destroyed the scientific school that Viktor Alexeyevich was creating. And this is not regarded as a corpus delicti.
How do you relate to the theory of the later construction of the pyramids at Giza? Do you think that when they were discovered, then they began to build in this way, casting stones?
Это вопросы строительных
This is a question
технологий,
about
потому
construction
что, чтобы их
technologies,
построить, требуется
because in order to build them,
транспортировка камней из
either the
каменоломни.
transportation of stones from quarries is required, and this is not the easiest task, even with our state of technology,
Либо лить бетонные
or
блоки,
casting concrete blocks,
тоже
also
проблема.
problematic.
Если говорить о бетонных блоках, то почему их не отлить как
But if we talk about concrete blocks,
опалубки?
why not cast them like a monolith using a sliding framework? But then there will be no blocks and stones.
В любом случае,
In any case, the pyramids are not a product of our mentality, and for what purposes they were built is an open question.
это вопрос открытый. Пока мы не поймем, для каких целей они строились, нет
Until we
причин
understand the
говорить о том,
purposes
как
for
они
which they were
строились,
built,
потому что
there is no
цели
reason to talk about how they were built,
технологии.
because the objectives, they determine also the
Вот
technologies.
был храм Христа
Well, here is
Спасителя.
one of the simplest examples.
Он был
There was the
построен
Cathedral of
на
Christ the Savior in Moscow. It was built with donations from the people. It took a long time to build. But then it was destroyed, and in the 90s, a model of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior was built. Here the important thing is that this was a model. Why? Because they wanted as quickly as possible, and therefore, inside the temple, the painting was applied not to the walls, but to a steel jacket, which is located approximately at this distance from the load-bearing walls. The steel jacket shields the interior of the temple from many earthly fields, cosmic fields. And the presence of this steel jacket, which has never been in the construction of any temple in the history of mankind, gives reason to say that this is not the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, but a model. The second circumstance is connected with the fact that when they were building, they took shortcuts. Welding of metal jackets is usually accompanied by welding deformations. If you look at how the template curves fit on this very steel jacket, you will find that the welding deformations are very large. And if this steel jacket was accepted by the quality control department of any shipyard or military acceptance committee, then, for the inconsistency of its forms with theoretical contours, it would not have been accepted. And so, well, there are shortcuts. But again, shortcut work is the result of the fact that the objectives were different. A temple is a kind of resonator of natural fields. But since here the task of being a resonator of natural fields was not set by the customer, then there turned out a model of a temple. Also, if you return to the question of the pyramids, in order to understand them, you need to understand for what they were built, on what physical principles, and what they did. Then it will become clear whether they are good in relation to those tasks, or not so much, why there are such technologies and not some others.